Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, paragraphs 14 and 15. Science in its early stages, when it has attained neither to completeness of detail nor perfection of form, is vulnerable to criticism. But it would be as unjust for such criticism to strike at the very heart of science as it is untenable to refuse to honor the demand for its further development. This polarization seems to be the Gordian knot with which scientific culture is at present struggling, and which it still does not properly understand. One side boasts of its wealth of material and intelligibility. The other side, at least, scorns this intelligibility and flaunts its immediate rationality and divinity. Even if the former side is reduced to silence, whether by the force of truth alone or by the blustering of the other, and even if, in respect of fundamentals, it feels itself outmatched, it is by no means satisfied regarding the said demands, for they are justified, but not fulfilled. Its silence stems only half from the triumph of its opponent and half from the boredom and indifference which tend to result from the continual awakening of expectations through unfulfilled promises. As for content, the other side make it easy enough for themselves at times to display a great expanse of it. They appropriate a lot of already familiar and well-ordered material. By focusing on rare and exotic instances, they give the impression that they have hold of everything else which scientific knowledge had already embraced in its scope, and that they are also in command of such material as is as yet unordered. It thus appears that everything has been subjected to the absolute idea, which therefore seems to be cognized in everything, and to have matured into an expanded science. But a closer inspection shows that this expansion has not come about through one and the same principle having spontaneously assumed different shapes, but rather through the shapeless repetition of one and the same formula, only externally applied to diverse materials, thereby obtaining merely a boring show of diversity. The idea, which is of course true enough on its own account, remains in effect always in its primitive condition, if its development involves nothing more than this sort of repetition of the same formula. When the knowing subject goes around applying this single inert form to whatever it encounters and dipping the material into this placid element from outside, this is no more the fulfillment of what is needed, i.e., a self-originating, self-differentiating wealth of shapes, than any arbitrary insights into the content. Rather, it is a monochromatic formalism which only arrives at the differentiation of its material, since this has been already provided and is by now familiar. So, we left Hegel back in that 13th paragraph talking about the need for science, if it is to legitimate itself, to be, in the end, made available, universally available to the ordinary understanding, to the understanding of the man in the street, and not just the academic specialist. And so this seems to lead into then his consideration of what he calls here scientific culture, the need for a scientific culture to eventually become more or less coextensive with culture as such. The need for it to continually expand. But he notes that at present there is this kind of impasse within scientific culture. And I find it a little bit difficult to parse out exactly what are the sides in this controversy here. He says in the middle of paragraph 14, one side boasts of its wealth of material and intelligibility. The other side at least scorns this intelligibility and flaunts its immediate rationality and divinity. I'm not really sure exactly, again, what is the nature of the controversy here, except that he does think that nevertheless this controversy is not entirely unfruitful. It looks a little boring from the time being, but there's a meaningful demand being made there. He says that the demand for science to basically get up off its knees and assume completeness, to render itself worthy of the name of science by finally, rising up to the challenge of its basic problematic. Um, and this seems to result in sort of these two differing attitudes, one of which seems to sort of side with science, the other which kind of pokes fun at it, or what he says here strikes at the very heart of it. Um, but what's interesting is that what this leads to then in paragraph 15 is a kind of impatience for scientific completeness and a tendency to, instead of going about doing the very difficult and painful labor of rendering a science complete, the tendency to substitute for it what I like to call theories of everything. Where you simply settle on kind of one master concept and use that to explain any phenomenon that gets put in front of you. The expression that Hegel uses here, he uses a few of them, but the word idea, the absolute idea. And he also uses the word formula several times here. A closer inspection shows that this expansion has not come about through one and the same principle having spontaneously assumed different shapes, which I think is what he would. That's the process of spirit embodying itself materially in order to realize its own freedom, but rather through the shapeless repetition of one and the same formula, only externally applied to a diversity of materials, thereby obtaining merely a boring show of diversity. Notice that he uses the word boring in both paragraphs here, which I think is kind of his general sense of the mood of scientific culture at present in the year 1807. It's gotten boring. It's in need of some kind of a stimulus. And part of the reason that it's gotten boring is that it's begun to go in for these sorts of theories of everything. The best example I can think, I can think of a number of them that we have to deal with today, but the most common one, I think, is the ideology of the efficient marketplace, the neoliberal ideology that really took hold in American politics from about 1970 onwards, and still very much the ideology of our current regime. Its central concept is this notion of the marketplace, this kind of hypothetical space in which individual free agents, little miniature capitalists like you and me, get together to exchange what they have for what they need. And the idea is that if you can understand how that works, you can understand not just how political economy works, but how pretty much everything works. Because neoliberalism, I think, consists largely of the tendency to take that concept of the efficient marketplace and expand it beyond just the phenomena of political economy and use it as an explanatory principle for pretty much everything. Use the marketplace to explain the psychology of love, to explain, why some marriages fail and others succeed. Use it to explain biological evolution, the ecosystem as a marketplace. They use it to explain, the birth and death of galaxies, everything. And it becomes this kind of theory of everything. And I think that when you have a theory like that, a theory of everything, you're essentially talking about a religion. You're using it as the efficient marketplace stands in place of the classical fiat lux. God said, "Let there be light," and God's will just becomes the immediate explanation for everything, in the same way that the efficient marketplace becomes the model for everything. And of course, in order to see it as explaining everything, you have to ignore a hell of a lot of what's what gets presented to you. The phenomenon that it is made to explain end up getting shoehorned into hypothetical models that they don't really fit. The knowledge gets cherry picked. You really have to squint pretty hard in order to make a theory of everything work. And I like that he sort of put that in the preface because, again, from a certain angle, it might look as though Hegel himself has attempted to give us a theory of everything. But I think that we're going to see that that's not really what he's up to. Certainly, the Hegelian philosophy is not nearly as easy as a theory of everything. It's not one idea that explains it all. It's rather a theory of how all the various ideas necessary to explain the vast wealth of phenomenon get generated one by one from the problems that they give rise to.